Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Hi, Peter, everyone joining us. We're gonna get started in just a minute. Let's wait for everyone to sign on here. We got Justin on scene, ready to go. I'm Nicole. I'll be manning the technical side of things today. All right, as everyone is filing in, we'll wait to get started in just a minute. Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Hi, Robin. While we wait, let us know in the chat where you guys are tuning in from. I am in Long Island right now. And like I said, we're going to get started in just a minute. Want to make sure everyone has joined us before we officially get the ball rolling with Justin, who's on site for tonight's tour. Robin's joining us from the snowy Berkshires. Hi, Robin. Cynthia's in Maryland. Welcome. Sylvia, hi Sylvia, Woodside, Queens. Melinda in Brooklyn, hello. Gareth, from Wales.
Gareth. We haven't seen you in a while, Gareth.
Hello. Awesome, we got Martha in Hanover,
and Martha,
New Hampshire.
Too. Yeah.
New Hampshire. New Hampshire.
Nice. New Hampshire.
New Hampshire.
You've been in Long Island too long.
I know, I have. Oh, Gareth is glad to be back, great. All right, well, I will introduce myself again to everyone. Hello, I'm Nicole. I'm a writer for On Tap New York, and I help out with Insiders as well. We have Justin on site in Lower Manhattan, ready for today's event, Retracing, Washington's inaugural New York City parade route, which happened in 1789. We're going to go way back today. So I think, without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Justin, our Chief Experience Officer, to take it away.
Thank you, Nicole. Let me click on my image, hopefully. Yeah, there we go. Yes, I know. Robin was texting me. She was watching the taking of Pelham 123. Lots of good subway sites in there. Today, we're actually not going to talk about the subway, and we're not even going to talk about Brooklyn Bridge, although I think I'm going to do a stabilizer walk over the bridge. They're doing a lot of construction on the Manhattan anchorages, so all of the portals on the Manhattan side are completely open, and it's a really great view into the anchorage. I'm not sure if you could see up there. That has nothing to do with George Washington, but hi, Pete. How you doing? Good to see you. On this site, exactly the site that I am showing you was America's first White House. It was the house that George Washington lived in from April of 1789 until February of 1790. So he didn't even live in there for a full year. But what happened in that house actually set the tone all of the other White Houses to follow. And as Nicole just said, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. When I'm on the phone with the stabilizer, sometimes I can see them clearly as opposed to when I'm doing a virtual presentation. So I'll try to answer them if I can as we go along. If not, we'll get to them at the end. But this address, when George Washington came to occupy this house, was at first somewhere between 1 to 3 Cherry Street, and then it got renumbered upwards of 8 Cherry Street. The reason why is we are no longer standing on Cherry Street. We're actually standing at the base of Frankfurt and Pearl, and this is the on-ramp to the FDR Drive, and it is a very busy intersection. But Nicole, if you wouldn't mind, Nicole has a bunch of slides which I've provided. If you wouldn't mind sharing the first slide of what George Washington's first White House looked like. I'll tell you a little bit about it when we get it up there. So this was called, this had 2 names before Washington occupied it. It was called the Samuel Osgood House because that's who owned it, and that's who Congress rented the house from for $880 for the entire term of Washington's stay there. Also, it was known before that as the Franklin House because of Walter Franklin, who was a very successful merchant. And who was also a Quaker, because right across the street was a Quaker meeting house. So he could just basically roll right over to the Quaker meeting house. Franklin would die. He built the house in 1770. He dies in 1780-ish. His widow, Maria, actually marries Samuel Osgood, and then Samuel Osgood leases out the house to Washington. It was considered to be one of the finest homes in New York, and at the time, if you can imagine it, this area that I'm standing in, which is literally at the base, an anchorage of the Brooklyn Bridge, was known as the swanky Upper East Side of Manhattan, because again, Manhattan is concentrated. The basic frontier of Manhattan is Chambers Street at this point, so just a little bit beyond City Hall Park. Everything else is still wilderness and village at that point, farmland. And this was, because it was nestled by the East River, sort of a really nice piece of property, bucolic, and it's going to quickly degrade. What's going to happen is it's going to be, by the 1840s and into the 1850s, the Fourth Ward, which is one of New York's most notoriously slummy wards. The 5 Points will stretch their way over here. This house will be taken down in 1856 in an attempt to widen the roads here and demap Cherry Street. And then it's completely taken off the map in the 1860s as they are building the anchorage to the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, Nicole, if you don't mind showing the next slide. That is a very famous portrait of George and Martha, and George's 2 grandchildren via Martha's children. He did not have children of his own, but a stepson. And that is painted at the Samuel Osgood house, the White House that George was occupying at the time. So now, in terms of the inaugural parade, because that's why we're here today, because of the inauguration tomorrow of Joe Biden, I thought it might be a really neat idea to retrace the only inaugural parade we had in New York, which did not happen in January, actually. It happened on April 30th, 1789, but I thought, hey, why not? Close enough. And we, a celebration. So basically when day broke on April 30th, as soon as the sun rose, cannons went off 13 times off the battery, what we know as Castle Clinton today, but it was the battery guns fired. Castle Clinton wasn't built yet. And then at 9 o'clock, the church bells all over the city, just think of the horns as the church bells. The church bells started. And they rang all morning for George Washington's inauguration. The city was alive and full of energy for the first president being inaugurated in the United States, and New York being the first capital of the United States. So what happens is about noon, Congress meets, a joint session of Congress meets, and Washington's not there, he's in his home. A military gathering of 500 troops comes to Cherry Street to pick him up, basically right where I'm standing. Robert Livingston, who is the Chancellor of New York at the time, also is with them. He helps to lead the parade. And there is a band of Scottish Highlanders with bagpipes who are also part of it. A brigade of grenadiers are also part of this parade. And the idea was they were going to march from here to Wall Street and Federal Hall. All right, so Nicole, I think what I'll have you do is show the next slide. So their route is down Pearl Street. We call Pearl Street today, but was actually known as Queen Street, sometimes known as Great Queen Street. And it took me a long time to actually find the exact route. If you look in a lot of primary sources, it says the inaugural parade marched through the streets of Manhattan. Okay, well, that doesn't help very much. And there was a couple of routes they could have taken from here. Even Schernau's George Washington biography, which is basically one of the best primary sources for the life of George Washington written in modern times, doesn't have the route set out. But there's a great book that just came out recently in paperback. It's called The Return of George Washington. And it covers his life from 1783 at the end of the war to 1789 when he gets inaugurated president. And there is the route. And actually, it's the route I had suspected. They go down Pearl Street all the way down to Broad. They wrap around by Fraunces Tavern at Broad, and then they head up to the front-facing approach to Federal Hall. So that's what we're going to do. And I've actually started walking. The map that you're seeing before I tell Nicole to drop it is Manhattan in 1789, the year we're talking about. This isn't year adjacent, it's 1789. So this is Washington New York as president. And he's only going to be here for a year. All right, Nicole, you can drop. I am now walking south on Pearl. So for those of you who are craving a little bit of lower Manhattan in your life, we are going to see very few sites that are authentically George Washington from his time. But I've also picked up a couple of fun little tidbits as we go along. Now, as we're going along, before we get to anything fun to see, the reason why George Washington is so important, and if we take a rolling stock, basically, like subways, of our intersection with George Washington, we realize we hear his name almost every day of the week. If we read the news, his face is on the dollar bill, it's on the quarter. He's a part of our daily lives, for better or for worse. And of course, George Washington, considered to be the father of our country, but yes, he was a slave owner. He had over 100 slaves. He freed them after Martha's death, but still, his Mount Vernon farm could not run without them. So obviously during this year that has been brought to light about George Washington, but also one of the things that we have to lend credence to is that the government as we know it today is really coming almost directly from the hand of George Washington himself. The Constitution of the United States, Morbo, really would not have been an entity without him. He pushed for it. We forget that the country from 1783 up until 1787 was run by a much more faulty document called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation did not really give the country a unified government. It let all of the states be sort of individual countries on their own. And for the purposes of a Federal Reserve, federal banking, that didn't do anything. It actually caused more problems because states started printing paper money without it having any value. And this was a disaster. Now, pause for a second. I'm just going to swipe over here. So as those of you may know, this is sort of the beginning of the seaport. And that is actually, that building right there is the Seamen's Institute, or the Seamen's Church Institute, which I talk about on the Maritime Tour. That's their very new headquarters, as opposed to their very old ornate headquarters on Water Street. Further up, I think it was roughly where 55 Water is today. So in George Washington's time, as he is marching down Pearl Street, or I'm sorry, Queen Street, as he knew it, the seaport doesn't really exist yet. This is docks. Water Street does exist, but mainly these are rows of docks for boats coming in for commerce, commercial purposes. Now, one of the first journeys to China on the Empress of China will take place the year after America is founded. They will leave port here from Old Slip on George Washington's birthday to celebrate George Washington. And again, he's not even president yet. So he definitely is setting the tenor as a national hero. Now we're coming here to the entrance of the seaport, and Skimmerhorn Row, which we'll see in a second, is actually built between 1810 to 1814 by the Skimmerhorn family, who are very involved in indigo and cotton trading. Now, if you look here, you're going to see that the seaport is put in the East River low water mark 1626, meaning this is shoreline. Now, for those of you who have joined me on virtual tours or on Dutch New Amsterdam tours, you know I'm a big, big fan of Manhattan's original shoreline. And Pearl Street used to mark it in Dutch times. So basically the original shoreline crosses the street, and we're going to cross the street with the shoreline, because that's the route that Washington would have taken. Water Street keeps going, as we know. Water Street is a very impressive canyon of very tall buildings, many of which built by Robin's dad, or designed by Robin's dad, who was on this. And here's, of course, the seaport. And this is about 10 years after George Washington's death. this seaport sort of starts to take its shape as we know it today. Oh, but let's cross the street. Hopefully I'm not making you dizzy. So we are going to follow Pearl Street because Washington did. So we're crossing over water, and you'll see how Pearl snakes behind that playground there. So basically, you've got the water line that goes all the way across from the seaport that I showed you over this way. This corner building, by the way, was the TD Bank. That was Edison's offices. There's actually a plaque there marking that. And this is where, again, if you have watched me on a Brooklyn Bridge tour, I told you that Edison filmed the Brooklyn Bridge being built, or actually was obsessed with the Brooklyn Bridge being built and filmed it. He was one of the first people to film it, which I've used that footage on the tour. But here we are now taking Pearl Street as Washington would have. And again, you can get a feel it's much different from water, where the buildings are taller and a lot more spread out. Now, Washington in 1783, he did something that defined the character of the country and the presidency itself. After the the Revolutionary War, was over, there was a lot of waiting. There was actually a lot of marking time. Washington was stationed up in Newburgh with his troops, waiting for the last of the British troops to leave New York City. Now, we talked about this on the Thanksgiving Day Parade for those of you who joined me. That becomes a holiday known as Evacuation Day, because in late November, those troops finally leave. Washington has signaled that he can come back and take New York. When he marches into New York, he finds a decimated city. He finds a city that is ruined on the west side by a fire in 1776, which is never really recovered from at that point, because the British are basically occupying New York and trashing it. There is nary a tree to be found. Most of the trees on Manhattan Island up to almost about Midtown had been deforested by the British and the remaining patriots who were trying to eke out a living. I do not have a light here, so I am going to cross. And New York is considered, it is not the largest city either, Philadelphia is. So New York is considered a secondary city, probably the only time in America's history we can say New York might be considered a secondary city. But because of its position as a place of commerce, it does get the designation of being the nation's capital first. But Washington resigns, and that's huge, because many people were thinking this great military leader who won our independence, the next step for him should be very clearly to take over the country. And he knew that that was going to be a show of force, which he did not want to start a precedent, because it could easily become a dictatorship. And he lays down his sword, he resigns. He gets the title of Cincinnati because of it. Cincinnati, or Cincinnatus, was a Roman farmer who, after many great war exploits, lays down his sword and goes off to go back to being a farmer and not an emperor. And that's how Washington will be known for about 5 years. But we're going to take a pause because I want to show you this really cool building here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back up a little bit. This, by the way, is Fletcher Street. And for those of you who may or may not know Lower Manhattan, Fletcher Street is one of the few lanes left in Lower Manhattan. It's big enough for a vehicle here, but once you cross over water, it becomes a very, very tiny walkway. And Fletcher Street was one of the few left where sailors would go from the main thoroughfares like Pearl down to their boats. But I'm going to turn us around, and I want you to look at the building with the parking garage in it. The building with the parking garage in it is actually built into the structure of the tall Marriott, which is also attached to the apartment building next door. And you'll see the building next to the parking garage building actually has what looks like a brownstone created vent, much like the subway vent in Brooklyn Heights for the IRT, which is a really cool fact. But this house was built by William Colgate, ladies and gentlemen, whose toothpaste I used this morning. So William Colgate was a soap maker. And in 1831, he built himself this house with a storefront where the parking garage is. When they were rebuilding these buildings in the early 2000s, this building was slated for demolition because it was not landmarked. There was a bar owner in the area who actually said, wait a minute, this should be saved, and only the facade was saved. Everything inside of the building is part of the newer structure. But this facade dates from 1831, again, making it one of the oldest standing townhouses as a facade in Lower Manhattan. But as you can see here, this is all parking garage. So there's no remaining inside of William Colgate's home. But again, that was William Colgate's home. Back to Washington. So Washington, he continues to march. Nothing of note happened on the route as he was getting to Federal Hall. But the parade took a half hour because everybody from everywhere in the city, from Jersey, people came from all over to catch a glimpse of this event, Washington's inauguration on the cross. So the streets, every street was plugged up with people. So much so that it said that it was actually foolhardy to put Washington in a carriage because they literally had to just move people off to the side so that he could get through. And this is going to be Washington's experience from the minute he lands in New York the week before, which actually I think I'm going to talk about pretty soon, because when we get to Wall Street, I'll tell you about his landing. But when he is elected president of the United States after his retirement, he's done so because he and James Madison and his Virginia contingent pushed for a constitutional convention to redo the country, which was failing because it couldn't pay its bills, it didn't have any money, and none of the states could agree on doing anything as a unified whole. So he is considered, he's elected president of the convention. He is considered to be the unifying force, even when dissenting states made their voices known that they would not ratify the Constitution. Basically, if George Washington said it had to happen, it had to happen. And of course, the Constitution creates the three branches of government. We have the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branch, each designed to keep each other in check. All the idea of James Madison and George Washington, who George Washington decides time to come out of retirement, even though he doesn't want to.
Do you want to flip us back around, Justin?
Oh, sorry.
Vertical.
Yeah. Sorry about that. He is unanimously elected president. Nicole, what is my next slide? I think it's Washington coming in. Is he on a boat?
Pearl Street in the 17th century, and then Washington on the boat.
Oh, actually, perfect. That's good. There's a method to my madness, ladies and gentlemen. We are coming up on Pearl and Wall. So, Nicole, please show the first photo. So, this corner is basically the corner that I am standing on right now. Which is the corner of Pearl and Wall. Now that is in the 1600s. Now that gate that you're seeing, that is the water gate of the Dutch Wall. So again, for those of you who have joined me on a Dutch New Amsterdam tour, whether in person or virtual, you'll know that the wall, which was a Peter Stuyvesant initiative built in the 1650s and kept up until 1699, had two entrances. The water gate, where I am right now, and of course the water was the East River, and the land gate at Broadway right by Trinity. Now those gates were closed at 9 o'clock at night. So you could not get in or out of Lower Manhattan at that time. And as a matter of fact, there are many stories of Dutchmen who were kept in taverns all night because the taverns closed at 10. And if you didn't get through the wall, you had to basically stay there until the morning. If you were outside of the wall, if you were at a tavern uptown. And of course, because the early Dutch loved their drink, hey, that happened a lot. Come to the Watergate, bang on it, nobody's going to open it for you. The wall is taken down in 1699. So now in 1789, on April 23rd, this is the scene. Nicole, you can hit the next picture, please. This is a very, very embellished painting of Washington, who had left about a week prior from Mount Vernon, Virginia, and basically had a week of partying on his way from Mount Vernon all the way through to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, which we know as Elizabeth, New Jersey, where he boarded this flotilla, which was built especially for him. Those are supposed to be 13 gentlemen in white and black caps rowing for him. I don't think there are 13 represented in the picture, but there are 13 on the boat for each of the states of the United States. And of course, George Clinton, who is the governor of New York at the time, is greeting President-elect Washington on this floral carpeted stair. And as you can see, there are people absolutely jam-packed everywhere as they come to greet Washington. And that will be Washington's experience for weeks before his inauguration and after his inauguration. So Nicole, you can drop the picture. And again, that's happening right here. And of course, a different scene today, but there it is. So let's keep moving. Now, you would think for ease of shortness, they would just turn up Wall Street to get to Federal Hall. They do not. They continue down Pearl. A little bit of history on Pearl Street as well. The naming of Pearl Street is quite a fun story. Pearl Street was originally called Perlstraat by the Dutch because of the proliferation, I always say that wrong, of the oyster shells that came from the oyster beds in the river and in the harbor around New York. New York had very, very robust oyster beds. And the Dutch would take what landed on shore, basically washed up, crush them as pavers. And that's how it got to be known as Perlstraat. Now, of course, they also referred to it as the Strand across the street because it was water's edge. And one of the things I really like to point out to people, you can really get a sense of how you're on higher ground here than you are lower on Water and Front and then South Street. That's because this is natural Manhattan Island. So much so that when Hurricane Sandy hit us, of course it hit lower Manhattan hard, it flooded all of the areas and even over Pearl Street, but a lot of the areas that we considered to be under sea level. So when the British come to take over, 1664. Excuse me. I feel New York there. Get a bit of that ambient New York. What was I saying? Oh, Pearl Street. So when the British come in 1664, they changed the Dutch street names. They Anglicanize them, but quickly. And so what they do is they name them Prince Street, King Street, Queen Street, and Pearl Street gets the designation of Queen. And actually there is a lesser Queen Street and a greater Queen Street, because what happens is Pearl Street shrinks down a little bit. That becomes lesser Queen. We are on greater Queen. This is Hanover Square. Hanover Square is actually marked on that map that I showed you. Hanover Square was for a while considered to be New York's second park, Bowling Green being New York's first. That is the India House on the corner. Actually, we're gonna cross. And this park has been renamed the Queen Elizabeth II Park. She donated the sculpture and the benches in this park after 9/11 to commemorate the event. You can see the benches, for those of you who've never been to Hanover Square, are very unique. It's got this twisty turn. And if I remember correctly, they were manufactured in England and shipped over here. And again, it was a commemoration of sympathy and also of friendship during the time of the September 11th attacks. fun little factoid, again, not Washington related, but Captain William Kidd, one of the first pirates, lived right off of Hanover Square, over up there on that corner. He actually set sail from here on his adventure galley, and then became one of the most sought after pirates when he was hired to find pirates. As we move down Pearl, what you're going to see here are these old buildings, which are actually the backs of the buildings on Stone Street. And again, Stone Street is one of the oldest collection of lower Manhattan buildings that we have. Let me see if I can, no, that's as far as I can go. I can't cross the street because they're doing construction at the moment. But these buildings were all built right after the fire of 1835. So there was a fire in 1835, which wiped out almost 800 structures in this area. The fire started off of Hanover Square, where we just were. These buildings were quickly built to replace all of the shipping businesses, or all of the businesses that made their money off of the commercial shipping enterprises that came in and out of New York. Chandlers, sailmakers, rope makers, all were stationed in these buildings. Insurance brokers for sailors and their goods. So here's the Stone Street Tavern, where, as Nicole knows, I had my 40th birthday because she came. Thank you, Nicole. And Stone Street Tavern is actually built on the foundation of a much older building from the 17th century. And if you go walk down to the bathroom, into the basement, you'll see that older foundation. Now, of course, back to Washington. Washington is making his way down to one of his favorite New York establishments, Fraunces Tavern. And we are coming, as you can see in the fore, we are coming to the Fraunces Tavern block, which has been landmarked as a whole block to commemorate, again, some of the oldest buildings that we have in Lower Manhattan, which were not consumed by commercialism or fire. Samuel Fraunces, by the way, will have retired from the tavern business by 1789. And who hires him to keep his home but Washington? So back at Cherry Street, Samuel Fraunces is in charge of all of the household goings on, and he runs the kitchen. So he is making lamb, he's making roast beef, he's making roasted turkeys for Washington. Washington loved to dine alone, but that really rarely ever happened for him. But Fraunces was his preferred chef of choice. Now, the reason why I'm stopping here is, if you see this yellow brick outline, we're at 85 Broad. This yellow brick outline is the outline of the original Dutch Stadhouse, or State House, or City Hall. So New York's first City Hall was here until 1699. This is Coenty Slip. During Washington's time, and even up until the late 19th century, Coenty Slip is going to be one of the busiest slips in New York. It is a huge port. As a matter of fact, when Washington bids his troops farewell in Fraunces Tavern at the corner, which we'll talk about when we get there, he goes to Coenty Slip to get a boat to go back to Jersey to head back to Virginia. But I'm going to show you this in case you haven't seen it. But I know a lot of you untappers, I'm sure, have seen this before. This is called Portals into Old New York. And this is the foundational remains of Governor Lovelace's Tavern. My phone did not like that angle, sorry. It rebelled against me. Lovelace's Tavern will actually burn in 1700 something. I think it might be 3, early on in the 1700s. This building across the street, which was actually part of the Phillips Manor, or Phillips family, who actually go up to settle Phillips Manor by Tarrytown, there is a bar there now called the Lovelace, as you can see, after Governor Lovelace's Tavern across the street. So they put the story of Governor Lovelace on the menu. And Mandy and I, a lot of you may know Mandy, our tour guide. We went to have a gin and tonic there because it's a gin bar. And they got some of the history wrong. So Mandy and I corrected them and they actually changed it. We weren't obnoxious about it, we promise. And this was a cistern. I don't know if you can see it in the reflection. I know it's very reflective. Let me see if I can take it from the other side. But this is the, oh, my phone doesn't like it again. Try that. There it is, that's better. This is the cistern from the Phillips family house across the street that the Lovelace is in. Which again, Washington would have marched past being a freshwater source. We are continuing to what I call unofficially one of the most George Washington buildings. This guy across the street, Francis Tavern. So the original tavern was actually built by a Delancey Street, who would try to go on and develop the Lower, what we know as the Lower East Side, as a residential development, but he actually is a loyalist and he gets booted out of America because of his ties to the crown. And Samuel Francis takes over this tavern. Now, the spy ring, Washington's famous spy ring, will meet here quite often, sometimes in secret, sometimes not in secret. Samuel Francis was obviously considered to be a patriot, not a loyalist in New York. Many who remained after the British occupation in 1776 were mainly loyalists, with a pocket or two of patriots who were fighting to give information to Washington about the movements of the British at the time. Now, Washington will come back to this location in 1783 to bid all of his generals and higher-ups in the Continental Army farewell. It is a famous moment in early December of 1783. They go upstairs to the Long Room, which the Francis Tavern Museum has recreated to look like what it was reported to look like the day that Washington bid his troops farewell. And it was a very tearful moment. It was reported that everybody cried. Washington actually wept. Washington was not a very good speaker. We'll get to that when we get to Federal Hall. And he said a very little speech. And it was, oh, sorry, Sylvia. Nicole, are we having trouble hearing me?
I can hear you. It sounds like a little muffled at some points. I think it maybe is just the wind.
Oh, it could be the wind. All right, let me get out of this way. Thank you, Sylvia. Sorry. I have my AirPods in and they're noise canceling, so I don't hear. I was hoping that would help you guys, but there is a wind tunnel behind me, and Broad Street will be a wind tunnel. I never thought of that. So if it's really hard, let me know. But again, is that better, Nicole? Or is it still bad?
I think it's better.
Okay. Just let me know when it's really hard to hear me. I'll duck. Actually, let me duck inside here by the Lapin, which is unfortunately not open. There shouldn't be any wind under here. But again, he bids his troops farewell very tearfully. Washington was not a good speaker. Right as Sylvia, no problem, Sylvia. Right as Sylvia was saying that she couldn't hear me, people's main complaints about Washington was he was very hard to hear. He wasn't an orator. He didn't speak very loudly. And so it was, whenever he spoke, it was always very genuine. It was always from the heart. And it often brought people to tears. That was part of his charm and his allure, I think. So I'm going to keep moving up Broad because we're going to have a windy stretch up Broad. So I'll try to make it as quick as I can. Broad Street is named Broad Street because of a canal.
You're kind of muffled again, Justin.
Okay. Is it the wind or is it the? Let me see. Let's go. Yeah, because I feel a lot of wind here. Is it better here?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's the wind then, because I can feel the wind on my face. Let me stay close to the buildings then. There was a canal that Peter Stuyvesant built up Broad Street, which was called the Hare Graft or the Gentleman's Graft. And it was promptly sealed up by the British because it stunk to high heaven. Many of the New Amsterdamers were throwing all of their trash, dead animal bodies in there. It was not a good scene. So when the British took over, they cleaned it up, filled it in, and and the street was so wide. I'm debating on whether or not, as traffic, we get to go in the middle of the street in a second. So when Washington would march up this street with his inaugural parade, this would have been the widest street they had traveled up. Broadway would be wider, but this would have been his best way up. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Nicole to change the slide. We're hitting a lot of wind here, so I'm not going to talk until the wind dies down. All right, so let me cross, and I think it should get a little better up here because I can walk now that there's no vehicular traffic allowed up Broad here. Nicole, could you put up the next slide, please? So this was the approach from Broad Street to Federal Hall in 1789. And what you're looking at this picture is you can still see there are remnants of Dutch buildings from Dutch New Amsterdam here. And that was one of the reasons why John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they hated New York. They hated New York because of its density. They hated New York because it was filthy, mainly from horse droppings and garbage. And it didn't look like a fully American city because there were all of these Dutch remnant buildings all over. So this building that you're seeing was built in 1699 as the second city hall. The Stadthouse that we just came from was torn down. The 1699 building went up and the wall came down in the same year. And it served as New York City Hall until the 1780s when it becomes a seat of national government. Not for very long. The first Continental Congress was called together in some form here, the Stamp Act Congress, as we would call it, to talk about what they were going to do about King George's Stamp Act, which is the beginning of the revolution. The John Peter Sanger trial, which actually Mandy Edgecombe will be talking about in the beginning of February in detail, also takes place at Federal Hall. And then, of course, it is more famously known as the site of Washington's inauguration. So, Nicole, if you could just drop for 1 second, that view you just saw is basically this view right here. And of course, you can see Federal Hall right at the top of the street. Now, Broad Street did something fun in the mid-aughts when they shut down all of these streets to vehicular traffic. They put in this timeline, which has significant dates in Broad Street's history. So 1696, the canal is now a common, which means after they turned the canal, sorry about that, into a common market area, this area is known for tanners. They had a really great conglomeration of tanners at the top of Broad Street. And of course, I will just give a minute to show everybody one of the most famous buildings in this area, the Stock Exchange, with its fake pediment. That pediment is copper and plaster. It is not marble because the original one was falling off. Also the buttonwood tree. I know people have talked about this. I don't know if Peter Taylor's on the tour today, but Peter Taylor sent me a great picture. That buttonwood tree was planted from the 1792 Buttonwood Agreement, which happened a little further east on Wall Street. And they keep replanting that tree because it keeps dying in that spot. Then Peter Taylor, after one of the Secrets of the Financial District tour, sent me a photo of all the cigarette butts at the base of it. I guess that would be why it was dying. And of course, the new-ish home of Fearless Girl. who was originally placed in front of Medica's bowl by Bowling Green. She's been moved here. And Washington would have actually driven right over her. Sorry, fearless girl. Because what happened is Washington was stopped basically right here, and he could move no further. The reason why was the crowds of people on the street were so thick. I believe the quote is, and I have a page full of quotes here from eyewitnesses on the day. They said it was so dense that it seemed as if one could literally walk on the heads of people. There were so many people on the ground that they took to the roofs, and people on the roofs of the buildings all around were also watching as Washington got out of his carriage and walked from here up to the stairs of Federal Hall. Now, the building that we're looking at here is not the Federal Hall that Washington was inaugurated in. This building was opened in, I believe it was the early 1840s. 1812, they took down the original Federal Hall. Nicole, could you put the next slide up? So, yeah, there it is. This is, ladies and gentlemen, as close to a photograph or anything that you could put up on social of the day, because it was a live drawing of Washington's inauguration. And it was done by a Frenchman by the name of Pierre Lecour, who was standing on the street, roughly where I am, sketching the people as they appeared on the balcony as Washington was inaugurated. But I'm not even going to talk about that just yet. That'll come in a minute. I want you to look at the building. So the building was all redolled up and redesigned by Pierre L'Enfant. I'm sorry. Yeah, Pierre L'Enfant. I don't know why I'm getting my names all mixed up. Who was brought on by Washington to design the new Federalist buildings that were being built at the time of the new United States. So he comes and he adds a portico to the New York City Hall. He adds a new sort of pediment crest at the top where everybody is standing, and he puts on more federal-looking embellishments onto the building to make it look like a seat of national government, not a seat of city government. L'Enfant will actually be commissioned to do, as many know already, Washington, D.C., the official capital city, when it is moved. So, okay, take a good close look at that. Don't drop it yet, Nicole, because what I'll do is I'll describe what Washington did. He got out of the carriage and he walked up at the ground level to the House of Representatives chamber. The building was divided into two chambers. Downstairs was the more public House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives was considered to be the common branch of the government. Upstairs was the more exclusive Senate chamber. He comes in, and when he is on his way, John Adams is sitting with the representatives who are waiting for him at Federal Hall, trying to decide what they're going to call Washington. Strangely enough, this entire first inauguration was all done by the seat of everyone's pants. Nobody knew what to do. There was nothing planned out. They just knew he was going to walk into the building and he was going to swear an oath to be the president of the United States. So when he shows up, John Adams, who is now his vice president, doesn't know what to call him. And he just kind of looks at him, and Washington looks at him. And they were debating on whether they would call him His Excellency or His Highness. But obviously that would denote monarchy, and Washington wanted none of that. So Washington just basically said, call me Mr. President. And that's why to this day, we still call presidents Mr. President. Washington was also dressed very symbolically in a brown suit of clothes, which was made by a Hartford, Connecticut mill. He wanted to wear American, he wanted to look American, and he didn't want to wear military garb. He wanted it very clear that this was not military leadership, this was civic, civilian leadership. He did wear a dress sword to show his military service, but that was it. Okay, Nicole, you can drop it now. So they welcome him, and he goes upstairs to the Senate chamber, and they had decided the last minute they needed a Bible. And I know Nicole wrote a great post on this a couple days ago. So they went to the Grand Masonic Lodge, which at the time was run by Jacob Morton. And Jacob Morton was the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge because George Washington was a Mason. He was a big-time Mason. He was the Grand Mason of the Alexandria Lodge. He deeply believed in Masonic principles. And they got the Bible from the Masonic Lodge. It's a red, thick, leather-bound Bible, which is inside Federal Hall. Unfortunately, we cannot go inside Federal Hall today. But it's there when it's open for public. And they quickly decide we should bring him outside so the quote was, so the greatest amount of the public could be involved in this inauguration. So they bring him out to the balcony, which appears to be the scene that you saw in the drawing. He steps out and he goes to the edge of the balcony. Let's see if they kick me off the stairs. The other day when I ran the route, they didn't. So let's see. I don't think they want me to be doing anything nefarious. He goes out to the balcony and this is his view. And there are people basically crowding the streets, crowding the roofs. One of the onlookers said, "It was my sensibility was wound to such a pitch that I could do no more than wave my hat with the rest, without the power of joining in the requested acclamations, which would rent the air," which meant the whole air was full of excitement, people screaming, people yelling, people throwing their hats up and hoping to catch them again. I have a feeling this guy's going to interrupt, but we'll see. So they open the Bible randomly to a spot at Genesis 49. And I'm gonna move out of the way.
Zero tolerance for the spies.
I'm just gonna move out of the way anyway, because I want to talk about this plaque, but if he sees a camera, he'll just keep going because he'll think people are listening. He bends down and he kisses the Bible after he takes the oath of office. The oath of office goes by within a minute. Basically, do you swear to uphold the President of the United States? Washington says, I do. He bends down. Now, it is reported that he says, so help me God. But no, that's talked about 40 years later. But it has been added into the lore of his inauguration. He bends down and kisses the Bible at Genesis 49, which actually talks about a biblical figure who has inherited land around a port city. Strangely enough, because we are standing in a port city. There is a place marked in the Bible inside Federal Hall that shows where Washington's hand was. Nicole, you can put up the next image, because I think I have pictures of the Bible. Oh, no, this is a wood carving of the same scene that I had showed you before of him taking the oath of office in front of everybody. Again, look at all of those people. The heads, like they said, you could basically walk on them, like a mosh pit at a concert. You could show the next one. By the way, Robert Livingston, the Chancellor of New York, was conducting the ceremony. He was the one who was asking Washington to take the oath. He is the one, after he kisses this Bible, which is the Bible inside Federal Hall, who turns around and says, long live George Washington, the first president of the United States, which obviously is very reminiscent of long live the king. So again, we're borrowing some stuff from the British monarchy. And then afterwards, Massachusetts Congressman Fisher Ames wrote, Washington addressed the two houses in the Senate chamber. So they all walked inside. That took about 5 minutes. It was a very touching scene and quite of a solemn kind. His aspect grave, almost to sadness, his modesty actually shaking, his voice deep, a little tremulous, and so low as to call for close attention. Added to this series of objects presented to the mind and overwhelming it, produced emotions of the most affecting kind upon its members. So Nicole, you can do the next picture. Washington, again, he was speaking so softly and so awkwardly. He had prepared a 9-paragraph speech, which took him 20 minutes to deliver. So he kept stopping, he kept clearing his throat, he kept getting emotional. It was very hard to hear him. Nobody on the street could hear him when he took the oath of office. Everybody had said they sort of collectively leaned in, but they could not hear him. They could hear Livingston. This, by the way, is the picture of the brownstone pediment that he stood on when he took the oath of office, also inside Federal Hall. Notice that crack. I know I've told this story before on other tours. That crack is not an old crack. It is a very new crack. When they moved the pedestal from off a gallery off the rotunda into the rotunda in 2012, they unfortunately dropped it. And that's the crack that resulted. I always like to say I'd love to be a fly on the wall on that day. But Nicole, next picture, I believe, is a painting. Oh, yes, okay. So take a look at this painting, because this is a very famous painting done by Arnold Freeberg in the 70s. Oh, I'm on low power, so I should probably, am I back? Okay, I'll have to pick this up. Arnold Freeberg painted this, and it's Prayers at Valley Forge. And this is supposed to be representing Washington in prayer at Valley Forge during the Revolutionary Battle. And Ronald Reagan himself said it was one of his favorite paintings of Washington. He had it hanging in the White House. And it was sort of spun into this mythos that Washington was an extremely religious man. And again, I had just said to you, Washington was a Mason. And Washington, even in his inaugural speech, he didn't so much refer to God as God. He referred to him, I have the quote, as the almighty being who rules over the universe and presides in the council of nations. And he also says that this invisible hand of this almighty being sort of helped to guide him and America to this point, but he never really wanted to call God God, which is why some people say he might not have said, God help me, or so help me God, because as a Mason and as somebody who didn't believe all that much in organized religion, although he attended Episcopalian services, he will after this inaugural swearing, he really did believe in a very different type of being. Now, Nicole, if you could drop for a second, I want to show you something here that many people miss about Federal Hall. And it's this engraving, again, of Washington kneeling in the forest of Valley Forge. And this was actually put in, if you can see it, let me get a little closer, in 1907. So many, many years before Freeberg's painting, this was a story that was told many, many years ago, 40 or 50 years after Washington's death, about one of the colonels finding him kneeling in the forest and praying. So nobody really knows how true it is, but Washington, because of his honesty, because of his compassion, and because of his devotion to the Masons, had such a staunch character. Nicole, I believe there is 2 more slides left. We'll finish those up.
Yeah, there's actually 3.
Oh, okay. Well, oh, I know. It's the painting. Okay, so go ahead. We'll do all 3. So this is the painting that is most familiar to the inaugural service of George Washington, and it's probably the most false. As you can see, Trinity Church in the background is not scaffold. They were rebuilding Trinity Church during his inauguration, and there is a version of this painting with scaffolding, but it would not have been completed. And also, they would not have had all of that spacious room to stand in. This balcony was very, very tiny that he was standing in, which you could see in that original sketch. All right, go to the next one, Nicole, please. And this is, I actually took this on Sunday after my World's Fair tour. This is a statue of George Washington at Flushing Meadow Corona Park as a Mason. And it's one of the few depictions of Washington as a Mason with his Mason's apron and his tools on. And this actually was a 64-65 Washington remnant, which was from the Masonic Lodge at the time. And is there anything after that? Oh, and this was at night. So after the
I think we lost you, Justin. Hello, hello. All right, let's see if he comes back in a minute. I think he is. Here he goes. Let's get his mic back on. Bear with us, guys. Oh, all right, here he is. He's back.
I'm back.
He's
I
back.
must have got cut off. All right, let's go to Q&A
Okay.
because I think my battery is acting up.
Okay, so we had, I saw a question earlier come in from Robert. It was about the painting you showed of Washington in the canoe, and he noticed it looked like there was a Native American in a canoe next to Washington's boat, and he was wondering if you think there really was a Native American there.
So apparently that's a good eye, Robert. I think it was Morbeck. Was it Morbo who asked that? Yes. Yes. So apparently only Native Americans attended, but also a lot of African American slaves came to celebrate George Washington's arrival as well. So that was reported, yes.
Cool. And then Peter Tannen says, according to Google Maps, there are 2 parallel sections of Pearl Street between Fulton and Beekman Streets on both sides of Pearl Street Playground. Pearl Street becomes Water Street. I assume that the other narrow part, Pearl Street, is the original Pearl Street.
Yes, the narrow, you're right, Peter, the narrow part, which we did not walk on because I showed you the seaport. That's the original. And I crossed the street and joined Old Pearl.
Cool. And then Melinda, yes, Justin will send an email to everyone, and I'll make sure he has the links that I dropped in the chat, so everyone will get the links that I've been posting as we go.
Yes,
if anyone
else
has any other questions before we wrap it up, you can drop them in the chat or the Q&A. I don't see any in the Q&A.
I did see one Q&A come in. It wasn't?
It was about the links.
Oh, it was about the links. Okay.
Yeah, I typed an answer to that.
Yes. For some reason, I don't know why my battery has gotten so low. I've done these before without a problem, so I apologize for having to wrap up the end. That was the end, though. I was not going to walk all the way to St. Paul's.
Cool.
And for some reason, you're also not getting my video, which I don't know why.
Yeah.
You're just getting my voice. So we're going to wrap it up with there. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Happy Inauguration Day tomorrow. And I will see you on Thursday.
Thursday, you have
an underground subway.
Yep. And
underground
Friday,
subway. And then Friday. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Friday is the exciting podcast launch for Secrets of New York podcast.
Yes. So thank you all for joining me on this windy day in Lower Manhattan. Thank you very much, Nicole, for moderating as always. Always nice to have you here.
No problem.
And I will see you guys. Have a good one.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.